Most of the people who eventually recognized childhood emotional neglect spent years inside a conversation about trauma that never quite fit, not because their experience didn't qualify, because they were looking for an event. And there wasn't one. This video is about why the absence of an event is not the absence of a wound, and what that distinction changes, because there are two fundamentally different kinds of childhood wound. And only one of them gets talked about. The other one, the quiet one, the one shaped like an absence, has been sitting without a name for a very long time. If you grew up in a home that looked fine from the outside and still arrived at adulthood carrying something you can't explain, stay with this for the next few minutes, because what you're about to hear may be the first time your experience has its own category. When most people hear the word trauma, a specific kind of story comes to mind. Something happened. There was an event, an incident, a person, a moment that can be pointed to and named. Maybe it was obvious, maybe it was severe, but it was present, it was a thing that occurred. That is what the clinical definition of trauma was built around. The presence of something harmful, something done, an act. And if you grew up without that kind of story, if your childhood didn't have a clear incident, a villain, an obvious before and after moment, then you probably did what most people in that situation do. You listened to the trauma conversation. You recognized some of the adult patterns. And then you quietly stepped back out because the framework required a wound you could point to, and you didn't have one. So you kept looking. You read the articles about anxiety. You wondered about attachment. You sat in therapy and described something diffuse, something that felt important but had no coordinates. And the thing you were carrying stayed where it was, unnamed, sitting just outside every conversation that almost fit. And that, without knowing it, was the first sign that what you were dealing with wasn't the kind of wound the trauma conversation was designed for. Here is the distinction that changes everything. Trauma, in the classic sense, is an act of commission. Something was done. Something was present that should not have been. Childhood emotional neglect is an act of omission. Something was missing that should have been there. Those are not the same wound. They don't look the same from the outside. They don't feel the same from the inside. And this is the part that matters. They cannot be found with the same tools because you cannot point to an absence. You can point to what was done. You can describe the incident. You can name the moment. But how do you point to all the times no one came when you were scared? How do you describe the consistent absence of someone who was physically in the room? How do you tell the story of a childhood where nothing bad happened and also something essential was never there? Research on childhood maltreatment draws a specific line between acts of commission and acts of omission, and finds that both leave real marks on the developing nervous system. The absence of necessary emotional attunement is not a softer version of harm. It is a different category of harm. What childhood emotional neglect looks like, specifically, is a home where the basic structure was intact. Food, shelter, school, maybe even love in some form, but where the emotional channel between parent and child was consistently unavailable, inconsistent, or simply not there. Not cruelty, not violence, absence. The parent who was in the room but not present. The parent who provided but couldn't attune. The parent who didn't know how to meet a feeling because no one had ever met theirs. And the child in that home, the child who was you, learned something very specific. That their internal world was not something the adults around them had the capacity to receive. Not because it was wrong, not because they were wrong, but because the channel wasn't there. And that makes a very specific kind of sense. Here is where it gets precise. Because here is what no one explains when they tell you that CEN is different from trauma. Different origin. Same nervous system. The adult patterns that come from growing up in a home where emotional attunement was consistently absent. They look, from the outside, almost identical to the patterns that come from event-based trauma. The hypervigilance in relationships. The monitoring. Always checking if the other person is still okay, still there, still not about to leave. The inability to identify what you're feeling in the moment, not because you're not feeling it, but because you never learned to name it because no one named it with you. The low-level alarm that runs in the background. The persistent sense that something is slightly wrong with you that you cannot explain and cannot locate. The hunger, that diffuse, unnamed hunger, for something you never had a table to point to. The reason these patterns look the same is that the mechanism is the same. a nervous system that was developing during a critical window, learning, at a biological level, what the world is like, whether it is safe, whether the people in it can be trusted to come, received a consistent signal. In event-based trauma, the signal was, danger was present. In childhood emotional neglect, the signal was, attunement was absent. Both teach the nervous system the same thing. Stay alert. Don't fully relax. Closeness is not stable. Your internal world is probably too much. What attachment researchers have found, consistently, is that the developing brain does not distinguish between what was done and what was never there. It registers both as information about the world. Both shape the same structures, the ones that govern how safe you feel in relationships, how quickly you scan for threat, how much of yourself you allow to be seen. And here is the thing nobody tells you about that. The child who grew up with visible harm has a story. It's painful, but it's a story. It has a shape, a before and after, something to point to in the room. The child who grew up with chronic emotional absence has something harder to carry. They have a gap where a story should be, and when they become an adult and something is clearly wrong and they go looking for the origin, they find nothing they're allowed to count. Nothing bad happened. My parents did their best. Other people had it so much worse. And so they turn the gap back on themselves. This must be something wrong with me. This is not a character flaw. It is what happens when someone is carrying a wound that the available language was not built to hold. The wound doesn't need a story to be real. It just needs a name. If you're sitting with the question, is this actually me? There is something in the description built for exactly that moment. It's a short recognition guide, a quiz and a walkthrough, designed to help you get a clear answer without needing to have had a dramatic childhood to qualify. 10 minutes, a name, and the beginning of a different kind of clarity. Link is in the description and pinned in the comments. So what actually changes when you stop measuring your wound against a framework that wasn't built for it? A few things. The first is the most immediate. The internal invalidation, my childhood wasn't bad enough to explain this, loses its grip, because it was never asking the right question. The question was never, was it bad enough? The question is, was what you needed consistently there? Childhood emotional neglect doesn't require a bad childhood. It doesn't require cruelty or yelling or anything dramatic. It requires a home where the emotional channel was consistently absent, where a child's internal world was not reliably seen, responded to, or made to feel like it mattered. That can happen in homes that looked, from every angle, fine. Homes with good intentions. Homes where people were trying. Homes where love was present in some form but emotional attunement was not. And the adult who came out of that home, still carrying the patterns, still running the old nervous system calculations, is not making it up. They are not too sensitive. They are not broken. They are fluent in a language they didn't choose to learn. The second thing that changes when the name lands is the direction of the question. Instead of, what is wrong with me? The question becomes, what was I never given? That is not a small shift. It is the shift from self-diagnosis as the problem to cause and effect as the framework. And cause and effect is something you can actually work with. The patterns don't disappear the moment you name them. The hypervigilance doesn't switch off. The hunger doesn't close overnight. What changes is where you're standing when you look at them. Instead of inside the loop, confused, self-critical, certain the problem is you're standing slightly outside it, watching it, able, for the first time, to say, there it is, that's the lesson. Not, that's me. The lesson and the self are not the same thing. They never were. A long time before anyone gave it a name. If today opened a question you want an honest answer to, the resource in the description was built exactly for that moment. Link in the description and pinned in the comments. What was the word or the moment that made you think, maybe my childhood is part of what I'm carrying? The trauma conversation is not wrong. It just wasn't built with a wide enough doorway. It was built around events, around what was present, around wounds that could be located in time and space, pointed to, named, placed in a before and after. And that framework has helped a great many people, but it left a very specific group standing outside. The ones who grew up in homes where nothing happened. The ones whose pain has no story attached to it. The ones who have been measuring their wound against an absence and finding, every time, that the absence doesn't count as evidence of anything. Here is what this video is asking you to hold on to. The absence was the event, the thing that was chronically missing. The attunement, the response, the consistent presence of someone who could receive your emotional reality. That absence shaped your nervous system in the same way that a presence can, not because absence is dramatic, because your nervous system was developing, and it registered what it consistently found. You don't need a story. You don't need a villain. You don't need to have suffered visibly enough to earn your place in this conversation. You just needed something that wasn't consistently there, and the fact that you've been carrying the weight of that without a name for it, that too makes a very specific kind of sense. You don't have to do anything with this right now. You don't have to journal it or apply it or turn it into a plan. Some things need to land before they can be worked with. If something in this video touched something you've been carrying for a long time, without a name, without a story, without knowing if it counted, let it land. It counted. It has always counted. Now it has a name.